Good morning, gentlemen. Today is a very, very momentous day in world history. After 1945, after a lapse of 72 years, war has again broken out in the continent of Europe. This is the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. While it's taken place, 1945 was the last gunshot fired in Europe. That's the time when Adolf Hitler surrendered. Rather, he shot himself dead, and then Europe was dominated by two big powers. What were they? The USSR, whose head was Stalin, and the United States, at that time headed by President Truman. There was no war for the next 72 years, but there was something called the Cold War. The Cold War was antipathy and antimony, I would say enmity rather, without firing guns and bullets between the Soviet Union and the American allies. But there was something else going on at that time, and that was called the detente. What was that? Detente meant that all the countries which were in Europe would respect each other, so there was no war again. I mean, you were, in a way, opposing each other, but you're not going to have a fight. And you try to live and let live. That's the old saying. This continued till the Soviet Union broke up. That was the very, very critical moment in world history, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it broke up into 15 countries, and Ukraine was one of them. Why it broke up? That's another part of the story. We'll talk about it later. But the fact it broke up and Russia became the successor state to the Soviet Union. But at that time, Russia was very weak, and they had a weaker president, Boris Yeltsin. Now, this man, if I remember correctly, made an overture when Clinton was president to join the American treaty, that is the NATO. Now, this was a surprise to Clinton. He never expected the Russians to express a desire to join NATO. But he was not going to allow, rather, the Anglo-Saxon powers, that is the UK, Canada, and the USA, were not going to allow Russia to join NATO for the simple reason they needed a bogey, someone whom they could always thrash at all times and say, look, there's danger here, so let's go ahead and join up and fight. Idea was not to allow Russia to become a bigger power, not to incorporate into NATO, and the Russians very soon realized all this and they withdrew. Yeltsin, of course, went away, and then came Vladimir Putin. Now, Putin, if you heard his speech just before the invasion, was pretty emotional. He talked about the great victory of the Soviet state when it was a rival to the United States. He was nostalgic about it, and he went to say that Ukraine and the Russians are one people. And that's a fact. The Ukrainians and the Russians are one people in the sense they are both belonging to the Slav race, and they were persecuted by the Nazis. Thousands of Ukrainians were killed. But the situation in 91 was something so bad, as far as Russia is concerned, that they had to relinquish hold over a lot of countries, and they did that. Ukraine became independent, though frankly, if you look at world history, Ukraine has no history of independence any time. And in fact, in the 20th century, for the greater part, it was a part of the Soviet Union. The Ukrainians then continued being friendly with Russia, and there was an agreement called the Minsk Agreement, in which they agreed to give up their nuclear weapons, hand them over to Russia, and they went and signed on the dotted line in the Non Proliferation Treaty. Now, some people are saying that was a blunder. A lot of people in Ukraine are saying that. But that time, the churn of history was so great that probably if Ukraine had not given up its nuclear weapons, it would not have got independence. Things were going okay till 2014. That is the time when the president of Ukraine wanted to have a closer integration with Russia. Americans were not going to allow it. So they instigated agitations, they instigated their own fifth columnists to create a psychosis of fear about Russia, with the result, then the Ukrainian president had to run away. He escaped to Russia. And Ukraine went out of the Russian orbit. This was an American plan. And what was their plan? Their plan is basically to ring Russia by NATO countries so that Russia remains perpetually weak. Now, this was from the time of Clinton. At that time, Clinton had decided that we want to keep Russia as an agrarian country, not letting it rise up. Now, that's a very, very dangerous way of thinking, but that is what the Americans were thinking. And of course, supported by their ally, Great Britain, which has now become Little Britain. It's no longer what it was 100 years back. Putin was marking time. He was waiting for his opportunity, and he got it. The Americans wanted to incorporate the state of Georgia into NATO. The idea was to bring NATO to the borders of Russia. Now, what is NATO? NATO is an alliance against Russia because they needed an enemy, a raison d'etre, as we say in French, for NATO, and they found Russia the ideal country for this thing. So, the NATO is going. And mind you, the Americans had a lot of plans, a lot of pacts. They had the Baghdad Pact, they had the CENTO, they had the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. All these collapsed. They were there and started by General Eisenhower, the President of United States, from 1952 onwards, but they are not in existence any longer. The only pact still in existence is NATO, and now that encompasses the entire Europe except Russia. The plan of the Anglo-Saxons was to surround Russia with these erstwhile Soviet states and ensure that Russia remains perpetually weak. Now, Ukraine expressed a desire to join NATO, and that was the crux of the problems. Putin said this is the red line. We cannot accept NATO as extending their sphere of influence to Ukraine. It was on the cards, he was not going to allow it. And the Americans and the British were very clever. They said, well, let's have talks, let's have diplomacy, we'll sort out this problem. But Russia asked for two things. What was that? One, give us a guarantee of our security. Secondly, ensure that Ukraine does not become a member of the NATO pact. Now that our great friend Joe Biden said is a non-starter. He said, no, we can agree to it. What was the option for Russia? The Russians moved into the eastern part of Ukraine. Much earlier, they had occupied the Crimea in 2014, and now they have set up two independent states which they have recognized in the Donbass region. I think Iran and Nicaragua and Venezuela have recognized these states. They are the Russian allies. The Americans were infuriated and they began to talk of a war in Europe. Putin obliged them, and now he's mounted an invasion. And as far as I know, they are just 20 miles away from Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. You know, there was a chap called Guliat Dahut. Now, he laid down the history or the theory of air warfare, and he had said that to win a war, a country must have a favorable air situation that is called FAS, that is complete domination of the sky. Only then victory will come. Mind you, in the Second World War, this was very true because the Americans, the British, and later the Russians had complete control over the sky over Germany and also over Japan, and the net result was what? The Wehrmacht and the Imperial Army didn't have air cover and they lost the battle, they lost the war. Same things happening in Ukraine now. As per the information which I have, the Ukrainian air defense system has been knocked out and the Russian army is moving in. But I have a suggestion here to the Russians. They must finish the battle within 7 to 8 days. Occupy Ukraine. Ukraine is not much of a force, but maybe if Putin had delayed this by another month, the Americans were going to give him to Ukraine the Tomahawk missiles. They were going to give them the cruise missiles, and it would be mighty difficult at that time for the Russians to invade Ukraine. So if Putin had to invade Ukraine, it had to be now, and he's done it. Now, the question arises, what happens next? What is going to happen? The world is divided, and the Americans and their allies, the British, have been shown to be impotent. Impotent in the sense they do not have conventional forces to match Russia, and that's the fact of history. Once you do not have conventional forces to match the enemy, then you are likely to use nuclear weapons. Now, here is the catch. Nuclear weapons are a good deterrent, but any country having them and using them is going to sign its own death warrant. That is what I'm going to say. They're going to sign their own death warrant. There's something called MAD, that is mutual assured destruction. That's not valid. That's got no meaning. It's only as so long as it is a threat. And should the nuclear war break out, MAD's got no meaning. What will happen is, I will just give you a statement by Nikita Khrushchev, who was the first secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, when there was a lot of tension in Europe after the American pilot, and spy Gary Powers had been shot down over Russia on a spy mission. At that time, Khrushchev had said, I have got to throw only 5 H bombs over England, and England will cease to exist on the world map. And that's a fact. England's a funny country. They got an army of 80,000. You throw 5 bombs, and then where's England going to? England going to finish off. They would nowhere. And it's not only England, the smaller countries of Europe, like Belgium, Luxembourg, Portugal, Romania, there's so many countries, Bulgaria, they're going to be wiped out. They would cease to exist. They don't have no conventional forces. They have no nuclear forces. They're relying on the Americans. And then NATO is not omnipotent because there are two powers in NATO, that is Germany and France. They are looking at the things in a different way. The chief of the German Navy had recently come on a visit to Delhi as part of a strategic meeting, and in that meeting, in a press conference, he said that Russia must be given its own space to operate, and we must ally with Russia against China. One fails to understand how the Americans are not able to understand the simple logic that the threat is from China and not Russia. But Joe Biden is like George Bush. Bush completely lost orientation when he left Afghanistan and went and started attacking Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And sadly, He's a war criminal in my view because he got Saddam Hussein act by a kangaroo trial. He was the president of Iraq, and he thought he's going to have all the Iraqi oil for America, and they got nothing. Iran is 60% Shia Muslims. Iran has got the influence there, and mind you, no American can walk the streets of Baghdad alone. So, what use was the fight battle in Iraq? Has it any meaning? None. They lost in Afghanistan, similarly, lost in Vietnam, lost in Iran, lost in Korea, and I do not think they're going to win in Ukraine for the simple reason that they do not have the conventional forces to match Russia. Russia has got a standing army of over 2 million, and it is a very, very strong military power. So they are trying some other methods. Now, what are their methods? To apply sanctions. Sanctions would be effective only if countries like China toe the American line. China has got its own axe to grind against Americans because right from 1945, they have been supporting earlier General Chiang Kai shek in the civil war in China, and he had to run away from China, to Formosa. He died there. Then they have been trying to ostracize North Korea. They went into Vietnam, got defeated, and now they are trying to bolster Taiwan. But I wonder how strong or how committed the Americans are going to be in case China invades Taiwan. That's another story. We'll discuss it some other time. But at the moment, as far as Russia is concerned, the Americans have announced far reaching sanctions against Russia, against some members of the Duma, some of the Russian industries, and the Russian billionaires who have a lot of interests in London. Mind you, England is very, very, you know, circumspect about this entire thing. They don't want to go in and antagonize their own economic health. Because when you're going to have sanctions, it's like a double edged sword. It's going to affect you. The Germans know it because if they don't get gas from Russia, the gas and the petrol prices are going to hit the sky. Germany produces nothing. Same thing with France. The Americans are also going to suffer, but at the moment, it's a lot of rhetoric. The clue to the entire issue now is that the Russians must occupy Ukraine within 7 to 10 days, throw out the Ukrainian president. Maybe he can go to the Baltic Sea or he can go anywhere and set up a regime friendly to Russia and then withdraw. Maybe at some later stage, Belarus and Ukraine will be part of Russia. And if that happens, Russia will rise like the phoenix. You know who was the phoenix? Phoenix was the bird, the mythical bird which rose from the ashes. So, gentlemen, let's keep watching this battle and see how it's going to proceed further. I will talk more on this topic little later on, but it's something very interesting. In the meantime, I will say goodbye and good luck. And if you like this video, then why not you just tick mark it as like and share it with your friend, your girlfriend, anybody. And now I will close, gentlemen, with the words of Subhash Chandra Bose, Jai Hind, and glory to India. Jai Hind.